Hi everyone, welcome back to the Ministry of History podcast. You're here today with me, Artie, the Minister of History, and Tina, a Deputy Minister of History.
Hello.
Welcome back, Tina.
Thanks for having me.
Fresh back from her holiday in Australia and Bali. Very, very jealous. She's looking very brown. Yeah, well, today, guys, we're doing the third episode of the East Germany series. And in this third episode, we're going to cover the first big crisis of the GDR's existence, and that was of the 1953 June Uprising. To be honest, it's really something that really defined the GDR's early years, and I think it really set the stage for how it was afterwards. The thing is, you have to remember that post-war Germany was divided between East and West, and by the early 1950s, West Germany the economy, because of American subsidies, was doing very well. And then in the East, the GDR, obviously under sort of Soviet oversight, was having economic struggles and there was rising discontent. And this is kind of context which leads to the June Uprising, where East Germans rise up against communist rule, but it would end up being violently suppressed by the Soviets. The thing about the June Uprising is that I would say it is often overshadowed by events like the fall of the wall. I feel like it's actually not that well known in general, in the general populace. Obviously, we know about it as history nerds.
It's always hard for me to reflect because I'm like a Berlin history nerd. So I'm like, everyone knows about the 17th of June, 1953.
But I would say in the sort of general, like worldwide, it's not particularly well known.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And I think there's also recently been a bit of a rediscovery of it, even within Germany. Like I watched the commemorative events that were held for the 70th year anniversary, just 2 years ago. And when the Chancellor of Germany and the Mayor of Berlin spoke, when they gave their speeches, they really referenced it as the setting of the stage or the foundations that would lead to 1989.
Yes, definitely.
They really drew a direct line between 53 and 89. And they weren't just emphasizing this common goal of freedom, the right to self-determination. They were actually saying that it planted some kind of desire for resistance. And even if you look at sheer maths and ages, you know, that's probably didn't literally happen like that. But I think it's recently been discovered in German history to communicate that it's the laying of a foundation for 1989.
100%. Yeah, the fact that we celebrated, the 70th anniversary 2 years ago. Yeah, so guys, we're going to get into it. Start with a bit of background. I guess, to be honest, it would be helpful to kind of, first of all, describe the relationship that the Soviet Union had, how the relationship between the GDR and the Soviet Union functioned in practice. So it's true that the Soviets, they closely supervised the GDR government and ensured that the ruling SED followed Moscow's directives, and key decisions did require Soviet approval. And obviously, of course, the Soviet army remained stationed in East Germany. And this is even after East Germany formed as a country in 1949, because between 1945 and 1949, the East Germany did not exist. It was fully occupied by the Soviets, and they were the supreme executive authority. But then officially in 1949, the powers were given over to the government. But in reality, the Soviets did still pull quite a lot of strings.
Yeah, when you look at the lead up to 53, the uprising, everything that East Germany was doing, it's literally it's a directive from the Soviet Union.
Yes.
You know, the leaders of East Germany are being summoned to Moscow and they're being told what they're going to do in East Germany.
Yeah.
So later in the years of East Germany, you see a lot more autonomy, but certainly not in the early days. Everything's coming directly from Moscow. Yeah,
exactly. So, and part of the reason is because obviously the Soviet Union wanted to ensure it would keep getting reparations. So obviously after the war, the Western Allies, the United States, wanted to make sure that the West was not economically weak because they didn't want a repeat of Hitler. So they wanted to put in lots of money and make sure it was strong again. However, the Soviet Union had other ideas, but you've got to remember that the Soviet Union had a very different experience of the war. The total number of deaths for all the Western Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, was 1.5 million. That's civilian and military. Whereas for the Soviet Union, they accounted for almost half the total number of deaths in the Second World War, which was 60 million, and they accounted for 27 million of those. So obviously they wanted blood. So they wanted to dismantle industries and also, of course, force East Germany into the Soviet-controlled Comecon system. And by the early 1950s, the Soviets had, they controlled 100% of the East German automotive industry, 90 to 100% of the chemicals industry, and 93% of the fuel industry. So they were extracting these reparations, and obviously this was really causing a decline in the economic situation and in living standards. So, and obviously opposition to the communists were oppressed, and obviously you'd had the Stasi as well, the Stasi created, and they had been trained by the KGB to monitor and suppress internal dissent. Now, what's interesting, and something that a lot of people don't know, Stalin had actually originally intended for Germany to be unified and neutral. And he actually offered something that would become known as the Stalin Note, where he offered to have East Germany reunified with the West. However, it would be neutral, but the West actually rejected this.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Stalin Note. I really wanted to talk about it, partly because it sounds so dramatic. The Stalin Note.
Yeah, I know, right?
Right? I feel like this is the making of a spy thriller in itself. Yeah. And I think it's a really important part of the setting of the scene for the 53 uprising that, up until 1952, so it's March when Stalin sends this note, although East Germany's existed for 3 years, they haven't actually started building socialism in a full-fledged way, not in the way that they have in other nations further to the east. And the reason is because there was actually this ongoing thought of one Germany, a unified Germany, which, believe it or not, still had not been entirely forsaken, even in 49 when the two nations formed. And in Stalin's note in March 1952, he makes this offer to the Western allies: let's make a unified Germany, which will be neutral, so meaning it could never join a coalition against one of its World War II enemies. Now, that would mean it couldn't join NATO, right? NATO has been formed by this time. This is one of the reasons why the West reject it, is they think it's just about, maybe it's a power play by Stalin. Yes. Yeah, he's just trying to stop the spread of NATO. They thought maybe it's a propaganda ploy. But also, it was immediately, this offer from Stalin was immediately rejected by Adenauer, the West German Chancellor. Not only because of Germany couldn't join NATO, they would have to enter into negotiations with East Germany as an equal partner, and they didn't honor it as sovereign. It's not democratically elected. But also, one of Stalin's proposals for a peace treaty with a unified Germany was that the new unified Germany would have to accept its post-World War II borders. And a huge proportion of the German population was not on board with accepting that the nation had ceded East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia. So for various reasons, the Stalin Note is rejected outright. Some people still debate to this day, was it an authentic offer from Stalin? Was it not? Did Adenauer make a mistake rejecting it outright? Was there a chance to unify Germany 40 years earlier?
Or if it was so that Stalin would be seen as the guy in history who had actually offered.
Held out his hand. Exactly. Yeah, was it just propaganda? Exactly. Yeah. So this Stalin Note is a super fascinating moment in Cold War history, but regardless, it's only after it's rejected that Stalin actually calls his man in East Germany, Ulbricht. Walter Ulbricht was the leader of East Germany. He calls Ulbricht to Moscow and says, I am resigned. There will be no one Germany. Build socialism. And so that's the really key thing, like one of the major triggers that's going to lead to 53. Yeah,
to the accelerated construction of socialism in the GDR. So Walter Ulbricht, the stalwart communist, the general secretary of the Central Committee of the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, the ruling party, the Communist Party of the GDR. He now wants to accelerate the building of socialism in the GDR. So what does this include? It includes forced collectivization of agriculture. What is that? Well, it was essentially taking agricultural land off farmers who, in many cases, had been farming it for generations, and it was given to faceless bureaucrats in the city who had no idea how to farm.
There'd already been a bit of pressure on this, but this was going to be really dramatically advanced pressure. It was going to become effectively impossible for farmers to deny collectivization.
Yes. No, exactly. And East German farmers were really, really not very happy about this. And also you had unrealistic production quotas. So this would ultimately be the trigger for the June uprising, but it started with with these unrealistic production quotas. You had shortages of basic foods in the shops, and because of this, deteriorating living standards. And part of the reason is because this accelerated construction of socialism was focusing on industrialization rather than consumer goods. Okay, so things that people need for a day-to-day existence were not the focus.
Clothing.
Yes, were not the focus of the government. So people were literally, starving. They had one pair of clothes. Like, the conditions were really, really bad. And as I told you earlier, West Germany's economy was booming because of American subsidies. And so lots of East Germans were going west because they saw West German industry rapidly expanding. And so, lots of East Germans were going there because living standards were increasing, the wages were increasing. So
and meanwhile, by 1952, standards of living for East Germans had actually declined compared with 1947, which is terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, they'd already had this focus on heavy industry. 60% of growth had been on it: steel, iron, energy, mining. That fit with both Stalin's ideology and Ulbricht's. But by devoting only 2% to consumer goods, it meant that these crises were already there.
Yes.
Before, in 1952, they even decided to go for this accelerated socialism.
And so it made it way, way worse. Yeah.
Yeah, and things like, that pressure on farmers to collectivize, it meant that a lot of farmers were fleeing. It meant that their farms weren't as productive.
Yeah.
And all of this has contributed even worse to the food shortage.
Exactly.
And it just seems like this terrible crisis. Meanwhile, within a generation, West Germany's become the fourth strongest economy in the world.
Yes.
You can totally see why East Germans, there's this huge exodus, which of course then only further worsens the economic issues.
Yes. 40% of wealthier farmers went to the West, which left thousands of square miles of land lying fallow. And then also, on top of that, there was a bad harvest in 1952.
True, yeah.
And so that increased the problem of food supply. And, there was an energy crisis in the winter of 1952 to 1953, which saw severe heat and electricity shortages in East German cities. So already by this point, you actually had unrest breaking out. You had food riots, protests broke out in Leipzig, Dresden, Halle. And so it was already a pretty bad situation. So that's the background. The mass exodus, known as Republikflucht in the GDR. So 160,000 fled in 1951, 182,000 fled in 1952. And just by early 1953, 122,000 had already fled. A very, very concerning situation for this young republic. And I think really also what kind of turned everything upside down was then Stalin's death in March 1953. That obviously led to the Soviet kind of reassessment of the GDR's failing policies. Then the USSR ordered economic reforms to halt the forced collectivization because obviously they could see it wasn't working, and to focus on consumer goods. Also pressure against private enterprise, because also businesses that had been in families for generations being nationalized, and people didn't like that. And so pressure against private enterprise was also reduced, as would policies against religious activities. So it led to a new course.
Yeah, this is such an interesting thing, is that you see the Soviets keep dragging in these East German leaders and say, now you're doing this. And then Stalin dies and they drag them in and say, now you're not doing that anymore. And for East Germans, there's this kind of reversal. They've been suffering terribly under this building socialism policy of Walter Ulbricht. And then Stalin dies, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union is like, well, that's clearly not working, so reverse it.
Yes.
And so
it's interesting how Ulbricht survived.
It's super interesting.
Because you would think that anyone else would not have survived that.
There were attacks on his power afterwards, which were just unsuccessful. But yeah, so we always say that this spark of the 1953 uprising, like the real spark, we've talked about, there's this whole cumulative situation of things are not working in East Germany. And then in the really big spark, we always say, if you look up a little summary of this online, what you'll find is that it's the increasing in work quotas, right? That's May 1953. Ulbricht says, we're not reaching production quotas. The solution is 10% more. So basically under socialism, there's it's a controlled economy, which means for you to get your whole pay, you had to reach a certain work quota. And when that work quota went up 10%, it basically meant if you couldn't overnight produce 10% more, you take a pay cut. Like that comes out of your pay.
Yeah.
And the shortages of things to access, the prices have remained the same. And people always say that was the final straw that led to the uprising. And I'd like to revert to the beautiful German word Jein for this. Yeah, no. So yes, but also a lot of historians I listened to, and even interestingly some East Germans whose interviews I watched, what they actually also attributed the spark and the uprisings to was this reversal in policy.
Yes, no, exactly. The new course, which was announced on the 11th of June, because the SED published in the Neues Deutschland, their mouthpiece newspaper, They admitted their mistakes, which I think was probably the worst thing to do.
Yeah.
Because what it did is that it not only proved to all the people who hated the policy, oh, we were right.
Yeah.
But then also the SED members, the SED supporters, the local bosses, they were very angry because they wanted it. You know, they wanted it to keep going and all of this kind of stuff. So basically, this pisses everyone off, essentially.
It was so interesting. Even one gentleman, he was elderly by the time he gave the interviews, but he'd been there on the 17th of June, 1953. His perspective was that when the government admitted fault, it outraged the people so immensely that it led to uprising. And his perspective was that what the hardliner East German socialists learnt from that is never to admit fault and never to concede anything.
Yes, because it makes you look weak.
So interesting.
And that's what the SED members and like sort of local party bosses were so angry about, because it looked like the SED was weak. But the crucial thing is that they admitted past mistakes, but they refused to revoke the work quota increases. And so this essentially means that the damage is done, but actually because they don't revoke the work quota increases, it's actually going to get a lot worse. Yeah,
there's no change to your current crisis situation. The government's just admitted that they're
basically the worst of all worlds.
Yeah, literally. Okay, great. My government's as incompetent as I thought they were. They've led to as much suffering in my quality of life as I thought they had, and they've not improved it.
Exactly. Yes. Many people saw the reforms as weakness, while obviously, workers felt betrayed. And actually, the protests of the uprising actually began on the 12th of June with 5,000 demonstrators at the Brandenburg-Gürtel prison. So does actually already start a little bit before. But basically on the 15th of June, you had a petition from the workers working on the Stalinallee who demanded a work quota reversal, which they presented to East German Prime Minister Otto Grotewohl.
And he doesn't respond because he doesn't want to look weak. But they hear on the radio how great the new quotas will be, and they interpret that as his response.
Right.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's actually silence, but they feel it's a rejection.
So this is really the spark that kind of blows up the powder keg, really. And so on the next day, on the 16th of June, 1953, the builders on the Stalinallee, they decided to go on strike, demanding lower quotas and political reforms. And an article in the Tribune reaffirmed the necessity, of the 10% work quota increases despite widespread opposition. So the strike began at 9 a.m. on the 16th of June. And so 300 workers from Friedrichshain Hospital and Stalinallee Block 40 went on strike and marched through East Berlin. It starts basically as this strike, and they marched through East Berlin towards the government district. But to be honest, as they march through East Berlin, the demands escalate. And it doesn't become just about the work quotas. Yeah,
escalate, I think, is a great word. It's like snowballing. You know, other workers are seeing these people on the streets. And one gorgeous older gentleman whose interview I watched, wow, did he have a strong accent. I had to listen like 10 times to understand what I was hearing. It was deep Berliner Schnauzer or Berliner Snout dialect. But he said that he worked in some electric factory. They didn't have something they need, so he had to go to another factory to pick up a bit. And suddenly he finds all of these people marching on the street. And he said he went up to them and said, what's your deal? What's the story? And they said, we're sick of the work quotas and we want free elections. And he was like, I want those things as well. And literally joined the march. In addition, the radio in the American sector, RIAS, was reporting on the whole thing. And it was interesting.
Which they could pick up, obviously, in
East Germany. You could listen in. You weren't meant to, but lots of people did. And I actually read lots of accounts that really give the credit for this blowing into a huge nationwide thing to the RIAS. Because although there was lots of just natural organic street joining of this movement of workers, the radio was also announcing there's a strike. There's a protest. Support your fellow comrades in fighting back against the work quotas, fighting for free elections, and march with them to the government agency. And so their numbers are growing as they're walking through the streets, partly in this organic, I'm jumping on board way, but also partly because people are hearing it on the radio. And that's what's bringing them to the protests.
Exactly. So they marched to various kind of headquarters of the government in Alexanderplatz, in Unter den Linden,
and they come to the House of Ministries on the corner of Leipzig and Wilhelmstrasse. If you've been on a city tour with us, it used to also be the Nazi Air Force headquarters building, that one. And by the time they get there, the crowd is 10,000 strong. They demand to speak to Ulbricht or Grotewohl. Otherwise, they'll call a general strike. And eventually, not Ulbricht or Grotewohl or someone even important is sent out, but they sent out like a junior heavy industries minister.
Yeah.
And he just spits out a bunch of like platitudes and rhetoric, like, comrades, I too am a worker, and they just boo him down.
Exactly. Yeah.
They eventually say, oh, we'll make the quotas voluntary, and people are not impressed. They're like, we know what that means in this country. They will remain in place.
Yes.
And anyone who doesn't meet them will still have a pay cut or be considered a bad socialist and be punished accordingly. So they're not placated. They march back away from the government quarter into the east, stealing like this government loudspeaker van on the way, announcing, tomorrow general strike, we won't go to work until we've removed these work quotas, until we reach our demands, until we're listened to by the government. And one source I read, I don't know if it's true, but I enjoy it very much. It would be very German, so I believe this would be true, said that having stolen this loudspeaker van to use it to announce their messages, they, at the end of the day, parked it very orderly where the state could find it easily.
Yeah, oh my God, so German. And yeah, of course, as you said, Rias is actively kind of broadcasting that there would be a general strike and sort of so adding to this kind of growing momentum. The general strike would start at 7 a.m. the next day from Strausberger Platz. And so this was what was announced, and they were broadcasting the demands of the workers. So it's now definitely become more than about the work quotas.
It becomes
they now want free and fair elections. They want the government to resign. They want the resignation of the communists from power. So essentially, they just want, free elections, and they want to be able to decide the future of the country, essentially. By this time, it's grown into a much bigger movement and become a lot more sort of fundamental than just these work quotas. So the stage is set for the next day on the 17th of June for a general strike, a mass protest. Yeah, the movement rapidly escalates. And by the 17th of June, protests erupt in 700 cities and towns across the GDR. So it really becomes a nationwide protest. Mm-hmm. So the day of the protest, the day of the uprising.
So overnight, a couple of night shifts have not shown up for work, meaning that we're seeing this strike really start from, the 0 hour. Mm-hmm. Early in the morning, the state has closed the Strausberger Platz, U-Bahn station, because that's where, the protesters were calling, let's meet there. But that's not going to stop the momentum of this movement.
Yeah.
I
don't think anything would have stopped it by this point, to be honest.
Yeah, although tanks got there. Yeah, unfortunately, that's when you're an oppressive force and you really want to shut something down, you send the tanks.
Yeah.
So workplace after workplace, the workers down tools. The city of East Berlin really does in many ways stop functioning, and government employed, the only unions in East Germany were government employed unions. Yeah. So like everything, they're also just representatives of the state. Nothing else is permitted, or the party. Yeah. And so, of course, when the government employed union officials pop into factories and try and get the workers back to work, they're just completely held down.
Yeah.
And then basically you just see hours of escalation.
Yes.
Setting fire to state-owned shops, the tearing down of party banners and propaganda.
Yes.
You also see West Berliners flowing into the eastern bits of the city to join the demonstrators.
Yeah, and the police were obviously completely overwhelmed. They were unprepared and failed to stop the protests, calling for free and fair elections, price cuts, and the release of arrested demonstrators as well. As you said, defacement of party posters, statues, and symbols of the Soviet and SED leadership were burned. So really quite a sort of stinging rejection of the regime up until that point.
Yeah, I think the first half of the day on the 17th of June, 1953 is just raging escalation in East Berlin.
Yeah.
Like, and like you mentioned, their demands are escalating.
Yeah.
Some people are also demanding reunification. That's certainly not something you'd have seen in everyone you asked, but there were people witness demanding that on the day. There were people singing the SPD's song, so more the center left.
Yeah. Social Democrats, yeah.
And there were even some people singing Deutschland über alles, which had just been adopted as a West German national anthem.
And I did actually read that there were also some people shouting Nazi slogans and singing Nazi songs as well.
Yeah, I think this is an important element. Always when you look at history, I love asking but what's the bit they've dropped out of the story? And this is always painted as such a noble, proud moment when people rose up against oppression. And of course, that's the ultimate core of the day. But people will always slide on in with that. And I think it's not only the communist propaganda to say that there were some Nazis unterwegs or out amongst the masses, right? Of course, people will always try and jump on board with an opportunity. This was actually at times also really violent. Like some youths climbed atop the Brandenburg Gate, tore down the Soviet flag. Okay, right? I can get on board with this. I get that. But their chant included, "We want freedom. We want bread." Okay, I'm on board. Love it. "We will beat all Russians dead." And that's kind of violent.
That is,
Can we not?
yeah, I know. Yeah, we could leave that out.
Yeah, I mean, I know they're about to roll in the tanks, but yeah. So I think we sometimes forget how violent this was. Also, in the demand,
and also there's a difference between peaceful protest and violent protest.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess when you feel you do feel you've been pushed to that, I guess you can never understand it until you've actually been in that situation.
That's true. Yeah, and this is of course close after the wake of the Second World War.
Yes.
You know, people's desensitization of violence.
And actually, also you've got to
thing.
remember when you look at these pictures of the June uprising, most of the city was still in ruins.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Like most of the city is still in ruins because in the east they weren't rebuilding because the Soviets, part of the reason why the uprising happens is because the Soviets are bleeding East Germany dry for reparations, unlike West Germany, where West Germany has rebuilt, its industry is booming. And so that contrast has really fed this discontent.
Yeah.
And so, when you see these pictures of the uprising, vast swathes of the city are still in ruins. And so that really gives quite a strong backdrop to the kind of discontent and the protests, you know.
Also, some of these demands to release political prisoners, a lot of that is, of course, an attempt to release people who've been challenging East Germany, right?
Yeah.
Genuinely, I think, unjustly detained political prisoners. But I found some accounts that also said that some former Nazis managed to get out of prisons in that as well.
Wow.
Yeah. And actually, some prison guards and police were killed.
Yeah.
Right, in the attempt at freeing political prisoners. So this got ugly. Kind of more ugly than I think we tend to remember today.
Yes. They actually even stormed government buildings. They, around 80 to 100 demonstrators broke into the House of Ministries. They overwhelmed the police, the Stasi forces. And that's really when it got kind of pretty urgent for the government. And, so they really were close to being toppled. Very close.
Yeah. A police station at Potsdamer Platz, the protesters managed to overpower the police there, forced them to strip, and then broke in, threw furniture and police documents from the windows, and flew a white flag from the windows.
Wow.
So really, the protesters are really expressing power over the state in this moment.
Yeah. So, the East German state is teetering on the brink. So what does the government do? They have one last ace up their sleeve. And who is that?
The Soviet Red Army.
The Soviet Red Army, which still doesn't officially occupy East Germany, but it has a very, very significant presence. So they asked the Soviets to bring out their tanks onto the street. So this is the kind of final line of defense, the defense of last resort, I suppose you could say.
And I think also the shattering of that illusion that East Germany is not occupied by the Soviets.
Yes.
I think the shattering of the illusion that
100%.
East Germany saying you're so lucky to be in this Germany. We're the good Germany. We're the humane Germany. We are a state of the workers and the peasants. But when the workers try and rise up and express their discontent and restructure, the full force of the Soviet Red Army 100%. Is willing to come down against you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, tanks, troops called out onto the street, clearing government buildings and imposing martial law throughout the country. And it was a pretty brutal crackdown. Soviet tanks fired on crowds and people were killed.
Yeah.
I've seen various estimates, but about 55 were killed either on the day or later after being executed from a trial.
Interestingly, I also found the number 55 constantly coming up as those killed on the day. And I did find a couple of sources that claimed afterwards they executed 200.
Oh, okay, really? After show trials?
I mean, this is a brutal crackdown. I mean, there really is the firing into groups of civilians. People are shot as they're running away. A 14-year-old boy is shot in the back of the head.
Wow.
And dies. It's ugly. It is true repression.
Yeah.
Military repression.
Yeah, overnight up to 10,000 people were detained, and with at least 32 to 40 summarily executed.
Yeah.
And actually also including Soviet soldiers who refused to follow orders. Yeah, the SED leadership pretty powerless. You know, they're kind of just sitting there like twiddling their thumbs whilst the Soviets sort it out.
I think that's terribly embarrassing.
Yes,
they literally
very
took
much.
refuge in Karlshorst and the headquarters of the Red Army in the east of Berlin, and they're literally just sitting there.
Yeah.
And at one point, their kind of Soviet master said, the Western news outlets are reporting that there is no longer any government in East Berlin. Well, I guess they're right. And he says that right in front of all Brink. That's a really kind of sassy.
Yes, that really is.
Yeah,
but it's the truth, really.
It's absolutely the truth. East Germany has failed its people so terribly. Its only power to shut this down is violence.
Yes.
And the Soviets have to do the dirty work.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's atrocious.
Yeah, awful. And but as also I mentioned earlier, important to stress, it was not just taking place in East Berlin. Demonstrations occurred in all 24 major cities. And many, many smaller towns, and at least 339,000 people protested. And 225,000 workers went on strike. So other various large uprisings were in Halle, where you had 100,000 demonstrators, in Potsdam, 53,000 demonstrators, and in Dresden, where you had 43,000. Yeah, and all the kind of same violence, you know, looting, arson, and attacks on SED functionaries that took place in several towns. Prison breaks, you know, where demonstrators stormed prisons to demand the release of political prisoners. And the Soviet forces were actually more restrained outside Berlin. And some soldiers actually sympathized with the protesters, like I mentioned just before. There was also rural dimensions as well. Village protests with over 200 rural communities that saw demonstrations, with farmers leaving collective farms. Protesters also focused on daily hardships, including food and shortages and poor working conditions. And so, you know, many workers opposed the privileges of the intelligentsia, because it's important to stress that, you know, obviously it was meant to be a socialist state, but there was still an elite. There's marches, clashes with police, storming of government buildings, these calls for free elections. This is happening all over the country. Okay, so it's rapidly spiraled out of control and become nationwide. And so that is why obviously the Soviets then had to get involved. So why the Red Army had to roll in with the tanks and have martial law declared. Now, at least 55 people were killed, over 10,000 were arrested, and many sent to Soviet labor camps. But what numbers do you have? Because, yeah, I did find varying numbers.
Yeah, so one book said 247 killed, but then lately in more recent sources, this number, at least 55 people killed on the day, that came up everywhere.
Yes.
So I think that must be accurate. Over 15,000 arrested was what I found. 1,400 sentenced to life imprisonment and 200 executed afterwards.
Wow.
But let's also remember that, you know, East Germany was not forthcoming with your information like this. That's partly why it's
that's
so
very
hard
true.
to...
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
And the West obviously observes but doesn't intervene.
Yeah, I think talking about the Western reaction, I do want to mention RIAS, the radio in the American sector again. Even the German Historical Museum, which is a very, very good source, should be one of the best sources we can have. They say that this probably would not have become nationwide, or certainly not at that scale, 700 sites, a million people. Yeah, if it hadn't have been for these radio announcements. They say that's how this spread outside of just East Berlin or just every district having its little things going on.
Yeah.
But what I found really interesting is that at 1 p.m., when the Soviet authorities announced a state of emergency in Berlin, meaning any gatherings of 3 or more are banned and anyone contravening that can be shot on sight, at that point, the radio in the American sector stops broadcasting that narrative of stand in solidarity, join the strikes, and they start saying, just be safe. Like, don't contravene the orders of the Soviets, which I find really interesting. They've been this really key element in the escalation, but then they're actually trying to like minimize harm and you know, loss of human life once it's apparent that the Soviets are militarily repressing it with violence.
So yeah, they're probably realizing, oh god, yeah, we contributed to how how like this escalated very quickly. Unrest does actually persist beyond the 17th of June, actually only finally subsiding on the 24th of June. And yeah, like we say, the death toll is uncertain, I guess just because, yeah, there was probably secrecy from the official documents by the East German authorities. So yeah, it does vary from like 55 confirmed deaths to at least 125, and as you said, many, many more as well. After this, many workers really lost faith in the socialist state after witnessing this violent suppression. Hundreds of party members, particularly workers, left the SED in protest. And you also had boycotts of trade unions, and many workers refused to pay union dues, which obviously undermined party legitimacy. But what's incredible about all of this is that Ulbricht, again, survives.
Yeah.
He survives. Like, the SED leadership is obviously in crisis. And Ulbricht's position as leader was in jeopardy, of course, after this uprising. And the Soviets actually did want a change. A report from the Soviet authorities in East Berlin did actually recommend removing Ulbricht and shifting to collective leadership. But what distracts the Soviets is you have the downfall of the Soviet security chief Lavrentiy Beria in June 1953. And that distracted Moscow from pushing major changes.
He was
so
also,
that saves Ulbricht's skin.
Yeah. I think he was also one of the greatest critics of Ulbricht. Yeah, I find this really interesting. I feel like after the 53 uprising, here was a moment where history could have diverged from its path.
Yeah.
And we may have even seen a profoundly different socialist East Germany.
Yeah.
Because there was, of course, then this attack on Ulbricht's power. Part of it is directed from the Soviet Union. Various figures in the Soviet Union were at first like, hey, it's time to get rid of this guy. But also from within some of the more liberal elements of his own party, the SED in East Germany, like Herrnstadt and Zeisser, so the leaders of the Neues Deutschland, the party newspaper, kind of a publisher, a mouthpiece of the party, and the leader of the Stasi in its infancy, in its early years. There was actually this kind of discussion about if the massive workers are against the party, it must be the party's wrong and not the workers. And these two figures kind of staged like not quite a coup, but they really did attempt to get rid of Ulbricht.
Yeah.
And it really looked briefly like it was going to go that way.
Yes.
And maybe even like they briefly looked at this idea that there's actually a core of people who hold power rather than one party secretary in whose hands it really all lies.
Yeah, and make it a collective leadership.
Yeah. Like I think there was actually one brief period where he wasn't referred to as the party secretary, but one of the many important members in the state of the socialist.
Yeah.
And for a brief moment, the story could have totally shifted.
Yeah.
And then Beria is arrested in Moscow. He was the biggest critic of Ulbricht. He was also the biggest backer in the Soviet Union of Zeisser and Herrnstadt, who were trying to lead this campaign to get rid of and replace Ulbricht. And the whole thing crumbles at the 11th hour, and Ulbricht remains in power.
Yeah.
Not only does he remain in power,
He
but
consolidates.
he
consolidates
exactly.
his position. He expels key opponents from the Politburo and obviously strengthened his position. And by August 1953, his position was secure because Moscow committed to backing him. And also, Soviets had learned their lesson. They stopped extracting heavy reparations and they started actually providing economic aid. So that was actually maybe one of the positives that came out of the uprising. They realized that the extraction of heavy reparations was not sustainable. And so that's when they started, actually really... Let's just say that the Soviets really took note of the uprising and they realized that something had to change. And this is kind of symbolized by the fact that they upgraded its East Berlin mission to an embassy at that point. Really sort of starting to officially treat it as an equal, although in reality, the Soviets are still very much the masters in charge.
I think that's definitely a legacy, is that both East Germany, or the SED, the party, and the Soviet masters, should we say at this point, both realize we can't let the people get this unhappy again.
Yeah.
This is the legacy if the people get that unhappy.
So I guess you could say that is one kind of positive that came from it, I suppose.
Yeah, although at the same time, of course, they decide, let's also really fortify the Stasi so that...
Yes. Yeah, that was obviously... I guess you could say that was probably the most consequential legacy of the June uprising, is that obviously because the government had almost collapsed, to increase their kind of grip on the state, they obviously massively increased surveillance and control through the Stasi, through the Ministry of State Security.
Yeah, you see the replacement too of Zeisser for Mielke, so you see the replacement of kind of maybe a more liberal socialist, could we say, comparatively to this really hardline Mielke.
Who would then actually end up leading the Stasi until the end of the GDR.
And
until
he's really
1989.
ruthless. This idea of the Stasi as the sword and shield of the party, protecting it against any threat, even its own people or a workers' movement from within. This guy is ruthless.
Really ruthless.
And you really see the taking of that line in the secret police emerging as a function of 53.
Yeah, the Stasi really starts spreading its tentacles around the state after this point.
Ironically, I read that in 1989, Mielke asked someone in the Stasi this isn't going to become another 53, is it?
Yeah.
And the Stasi officer was like, no, that's why we're here. I was wrong on that one, was I?
Yeah, well, obviously, as we've mentioned, shift on economic policy. So the government abandoned extreme socialist policies like the work quota increases, and they now started focusing a lot more on consumer goods. Housing, price controls, and improving living conditions. And obviously the fact that the Soviets stopped extracting heavy reparations, that definitely helped.
Of course, at the end of the day, the regime has revealed what kind of regime it is.
Yes.
It's violent.
Repressive regime.
Yeah, it's not listening to the masses. I think for a lot of East Germans, this idea that they're living in the good Germany.
Yeah, and the GDR actually brands the uprising as a fascist coup attempt.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That's super interesting. So West Germany is going to say, already the next day it's published in West German newspapers, lines like the working class have risen up against the Bolshevik exploiters. So I think one of the most interesting questions about this uprising is, how does East Germany swing this in propaganda? Like, it's classic, it's quite cheeky. They paint the whole uprising as a fascist coup attempt and suggest that the whole thing was orchestrated by the West.
Yeah.
So there's no acknowledgement of our own people were genuinely unhappy. It's literally like, this is all fascists.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that's something that they quite like to fall back onto.
Always blame the fascists. So if anything goes wrong, it was always the fascists.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is also, I guess what it did was it was actually really the first crack in Soviet control. I mean, obviously this crack wouldn't obviously lead to a crumble of Soviet control until the late 80s, but it did foreshadow another uprising in Hungary, in Budapest in 1956, and in Prague in 1968. Uprisings that were very, very similar, all anti-communist uprisings, which both were also very brutally suppressed. And I guess ultimately, though, I guess you could say was also foreshadowed 1989, which would obviously actually lead to the collapse of communism. But yeah, that obviously wouldn't happen for another 34 years. So let's talk about what we can see from it today around the city, its legacy today. Something that we talk about on our tours a lot that we go past is a mural. It's actually quite a beautiful mural on the former Air Force Ministry, the Detlef House, which is now the Finance Ministry, called Aufbau der Republik. That was actually put there in 1952 and is designed to show you what obviously the SED would like you to think the building of socialism was like in the GDR. Everyone on it's very happy, people are playing music, clapping, carrying
Everyone's
banners.
Very good looking,
yes,
like unnervingly good looking.
Yes, exactly. And it's people are, looking very happy and just, it's wonderfully harmonious. You can see a party boss shaking hands with a local worker. And so it's very harmonious. And, just a year later, you have this uprising. So, and so now you have a big panel on the floor that has an image from the June uprising to show you that things were not all rosy in the GDR.
Yeah, that's a really, really dramatic memorial. You've got on the wall of the house this mural in the style of socialist realism. They're saying this is the reality. And then on the ground at your feet, you've got this photo of people on the 17th of June, 1953, showing what the reality actually was. Talking of legacy, I did actually want to bring into this Brecht. Because this is such an interesting element of the story. Bertolt Brecht was somewhat of the darling of the left. Ideologically a communist. He chose to move into East Germany, right? We always talk about people fleeing East Germany, and often on tours people ask, did anyone go the other way? And
that is actually such a common question. That's so true.
Yeah, there are some really great stories.
And what do you
that.
say? Because I say there were instances, but it was usually just communists who wanted to live in the East.
Yeah, exactly. But so Bertolt Brecht had actually taken refuge from Nazi Germany in America. Not done very well there in Hollywood, although he was a brilliant screen playwright because, of course, he was a communist. And so he chose, after the war was over, to live in East Germany. He wanted to live in the socialist Germany. He nonetheless never joined the party, but he was, a supporter of the state in the sense that he, with his whole heart and soul, wanted a socialist Germany.
Yeah.
And actually on the day of the protests, he wrote a letter to Ulbricht showing solidarity with the state. And it was published in Neues Deutschland, in the SED's mouthpiece, but they left out the sentence in which Ulbricht's letter had talked about the importance for consultation with the masses about the speed of building socialism.
Right.
They just totally left that bit out. And I found this amazing poem that Brecht wrote very soon after the uprising, which of course for censorship reasons wasn't published until after his death. And it's just an incredible piece of writing. So it's in reference to this really awful letter that was in Neues Deutschland, the SED's mouthpiece, a couple of days after the uprising, whereby this bureaucrat basically said, like, oh, that was a terrible thing you did. It's really patronizing. It's really like erniedrigend. Like, it really makes the workers small.
Yeah.
Terrible thing you did going on strike, like you bad little children. You have lost the trust of the state. That will take so much hard work. You will have to work even harder to win it back.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Brecht wrote this incredible poem, which of course couldn't immediately be published. After the uprising of the 17th June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stahlenallee, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. And here are these incredible words that I think have become quite iconic in recent German history. Would it not be easier in that case for the government to dissolve the people and elect another?
I love that.
This is
amazing.
why Brecht is Brecht.
Yeah.
Ne?
Well, yeah, very pertinent quote. That's incredible. And that goes right to the heart of what this is. They wanted to be able to choose their own path. And the people are the people. And they weren't going to be moved. They weren't going to be dissolved. So they were going to try and ensure that they could get a say in the future.
I think it is one of the legacies of 17th of June, 1953. I mean, obviously there are all these political legacies, but also, writing is forever.
Fabulous poem. Very, very pertinent. Really good. I guess final thoughts. So the June uprising wasn't successful. But I think it did show that, East Germans, they resisted dictatorship long before 1989. And I think part of the reason, that why it's overlooked is because people focus so much on 1989 and that being a kind of successful, peaceful revolution. Important to remember that very early on in East Germany's existence, you did have this, stark resistance against the SED's very tyrannical rule. So it's important to remember that. And the suppression of it really kind of set the stage for the regime of surveillance that would follow.
Absolutely. Also, when people on tours ask, like, oh, wow, people put up with the wall. And you can say, well, when they tried to go to the streets, this is what happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
There's
exactly.
that culture of fear of your state and how unable you really are to safely speak out against it.
Of course.
1953 really demonstrates that.
Yeah. No, because of course, I think also you and I would very much agree with the aims of what East Germany was trying to do. But unfortunately, the way they were trying to do it was just all wrong. You don't get people behind you by forcing them. You have to make the conditions right. You have to bring them with you.
And especially for a state daring to call itself the German Democratic
Exactly,
Republic.
Yeah.
And when your people try to speak to you, you shoot at them with tanks.
Yes.
I think this really shot through the lie of the name of the nation.
It says a lot more than words can. It's actions that speak a lot louder than words, like Democratic Republic. Okay, guys. Well, thank you for listening. When you're in Berlin, do go and see the various memorial sites for the 17th of June. And the reason why you will see many streets in Germany called Straße des 17. Juni or 17th of June Street, that is the reason why, is because of the uprising that took place on the 17th of June 1953. So remember that. If you're ever in Germany, it's not just in Berlin, in places around the country, and you see a street that is called the 17th of June, this is what it's named after. Okay?
I just thought of one more thing. Yeah. I'm sorry. I feel like we should maybe have mentioned that even the same year, the 17th of June was made a public holiday in West Germany. Yeah, and actually it served then throughout the years of West Germany as like a day of hoped German reunification.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice. And then it was then changed after reunification to the 3rd of October.
Yeah, the date it actually happened.
The date of reunification. Cool. Okay, that's everything from us. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informative. We will catch you next time for another episode of the East Germany series. But for now, thank you so much for listening and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.